beneath the red moon? It's a bad sign.
No. He laughs because his spirit knows no fear.
In the village of Umuodo, a strange night came. The moon was red like fire, and even the dogs refused to bark. The old women whispered that something powerful was entering the world. In a small mud hut by the river, a woman named Ebola groaned in labor. Her husband, a wandering drummer, had long vanished on his travels, leaving her alone. But as dawn neared, she gave birth to a boy who did not cry. No, he laughed. A small, strange laugh that echoed softly through the hut. The midwife gasped and said, "This child laughs at the world before it even greets him." They named him Mbe, the tortoise, for he was slow, quiet, and always seemed to hide his thoughts inside a shell. As Mbe grew, his strangeness only deepened. He spoke to birds as though they were his kin. He would sit beneath the great Odara tree, watching ants march in lines, and say softly,
"You eat, little ones, before the rain comes."
Talking to birds again? Foolish child.
They listen better than people do.
The villagers laughed. Ebola's son has no sense. They said, he will never farm, never trade, never marry. His head is full of feathers. Mbe only smiled and replied, "Feathers help one to fly." Even as a child, his eyes held a kind of knowing, but no one cared to look deep enough to see it. By the time Meb became a young man, everyone knew him as the village fool. He wore bright, torn clothes sewn from scraps, and carried a small drum that never left his side. Each market day, he danced and sang foolish songs. Children followed him, clapping and shouting, "Fool, fool, dance for us." He bowed and replied, even the fool knows the road to laughter." Though they mocked him, he always found a way to make them smile, even those who despised him most. One day, an old traveler with white hair stopped to watch Mbe dance. When Mbe finished, the man said, "Boy, you drum with joy, but not with heart." He handed Mbe his own drum, carved with sacred marks, and taught him to listen before he struck. "The world speaks in rhythm," the old man said. "When you learn to hear it, you will know more than kings." Mbe listened carefully, and that night, he heard the rhythm of wind, water, and whispers of destiny. One night, while Mbe was about to wash, he found a child crying, trapped by the river's edge. He pulled him free and carried him home. He came back to the same river to continue his washing, but just as he was about to start, he heard a voice, gentle like flowing water. It said, "The foolish heart that helps another is wiser than the proud heart that stands aside." Mbe looked around. He didn't see anybody. He saw only the moon's reflection smiling back. He was puzzled, but could only think in his mind, who could have said that? He wondered. Mbe's kindness had a way of finding trouble, or perhaps trouble had a way of finding him. It began on market day, when a farmer named Okoro stumbled into the village square, dust on his wrapper and desperation in his eyes. He collapsed at the foot of the ancient Iroko tree, where the elders gathered. With Mbe entertaining them, the story poured out of him like water from a broken pot. "Chief Obi has taken my yam field," he said, his voice cracking. "The land my father farmed, and his father before him. He claims it belongs to the palace, so now it's royal property. My children will starve. The harvest season is upon us." And without that field, the elders shifted uncomfortably on their stools. Everyone knew Chief Obi. Everyone knew his appetite not just for yams, but for anything he could claim, twist, or take. And everyone knew that speaking against him was like spitting into the wind. It would only blow back into your face. Everyone except Mbe. "How long has your family worked that land?" Mbe asked, stepping forward from where he'd been listening in the shade. "3 generations. My brother," Okoro said, looking up with the faint light of hope in his eyes. "I have the shrine stones my grandfather placed at the boundaries. I have witnesses who remember my father clearing the bush there as a young man. But no title from the palace," one elder muttered, and the others nodded sadly. In matters of land, the chief's word carried the weight of law, and Chief Obi's word was as heavy as his belly, and twice as greedy. Mbe was quiet for a long moment, his clever eyes distant, then that familiar smile spread across his face. "Leave this to me," Mbe said. "What can you do?" Okoro asked. "The chief has already sent his men to guard the field. They say if I set foot on it, I'll be arrested for trespassing on royal land." "Sometimes," Mbe said softly, The powerful forget that there are powers greater than titles and compounds. He placed a hand on the farmer's shoulder. Go home, rest. By tomorrow's sun, you'll have your field back. That night, when the moon hung full and silver over the village, Mbe prepared himself. He grinded white clay, the sacred na used for burials and spirit ceremonies, mixing it with water until it became a paste. Then, in the darkness of his hut, he painted himself. Not quickly, not carelessly, but with the precision of ritual. He covered every inch of his skin, face, arms, legs, torso, until he looked like a walking ghost, a spirit given flesh. He drew symbols on his chest and forehead, the marks that ancestors were in the old stories. He wrapped himself in a white cloth that hung from his shoulders like shrouds, and in his hand, he carried a staff crowned with chicken feathers and cowrie shells that rattled like bones. When he stepped into the night, even the dogs fell silent. Chief Obi's compound sat on high ground, surrounded by a wall of red mud and pride. Torches burned at the gate, and 2 guards dozed on stools, their machetes across their laps. Mbe didn't wake them. He simply walked past, silent as mist, and into the chief's courtyard. The compound was quiet except for snoring from the main house. Mbe positioned himself beneath the chief's window, in a shaft of moonlight that made his white painted body glow like something not quite of this world. Then he began to sing, not loudly, not like a living man, but in a voice that scraped against the ear like a palm frond on stone, low, hollow, ancient. He sang in the old tongue, words that most villagers had forgotten, but still remembered in their bones. Words about land and blood, debt and justice, the claims of the dead on the living. A light flickered in the chief's window. Mbe stopped singing. He planted his staff in the ground with a thud that seemed to echo from the earth itself. Chief Obi, he called, and his voice was no longer his own. It was deeper, as if speaking from the bottom of a well, with an echo that shouldn't exist in open air. The window shutter creaked open. A fat face peered out, eyes wide in the darkness. Who dares? The chief stammered, but his voice was already thin with fear. Mbe raised his staff, and the shells and feathers rattled like dry bones dancing. I am the voice of the land, he intoned. The speaker for soil that remembers whose blood watered it, whose sweat blessed it, whose ancestors sleep beneath it. Spirit. The word came out as barely a whisper. 3 generations have farmed the field you claim, Mbe continued, his painted face catching the moonlight in a way that made his features seem to shift and blur. 3 generations of offerings, of prayers, of respect. The land knows its keepers, Chief Obi, and the land does not forget. The chief stumbled backward from the window, and Mbe heard something crash inside, probably a water pot. I have right. The palace, the chief tried, but his words tangled on themselves. The palace? Mbe's laughter was like wind through a graveyard. What palace existed before the land? What chief ruled before the earth was here to rule? You claim what you did not plant. You harvest what you did not sow. You take what is not given. He slammed the staff down again, and from somewhere, perhaps from Mbe's throat, perhaps from the compound walls, perhaps from the very air, came a sound like thunder heard from far away. Touch that yam field again, Mbe said, his voice dropping to something that felt like cold water running down the spine, and I will turn your harvest to dust, your granaries to ash, your wealth to wine. The land gives, Chief Obi, but the land can also take away. I didn't know. The chief's voice was nearly sobbing now. The ancestors, I didn't know they claimed it. Now you know, Mbe said. Return what you have stolen. Before the sun rises, or when you next enter Theum House, you will find only emptiness, and your name will become a curse that mothers used to frighten children. He began to back away, still facing the window, his white painted form seeming to dissolve into the moonlight and shadows. The last thing the chief saw was the glow of those painted symbols, and then Mbe was gone, swallowed by the night, as if he had never been. Behind him, he heard the chief bellowing for his servants, his voice high with panic. Get Okoro. Now. Tell him the land is his. The palace made a mistake. Go now. By the time Mbe reached his hut and began washing the clay from his skin, he was smiling. Dawn came, and with it, Okoro, running through the village with tears streaming down his face. But these were tears of joy. The chief's messenger came before sunrise. He said, breathless, grabbing Mbe's hands. He returned the land, apologized, said the palace records were wrong, that my family's claim is valid, that I should forgive the confusion. He was laughing and crying at once. How did you do it? What did you say to him? Mbe shrugged, studying his fingernails, where a little white clay still lingered in the creases. I simply reminded him that some debts cannot be paid with titles or treasure. Some claims are older than palaces.
Far away in the great palace of Umuodo, King Odum tossed on his bed. His kingdom was restless. His wise men argued over laws and prophecies, yet none could bring peace to the land. The king rose and gazed out his window at the moonlit village. He laid back in his bed, still troubled. He sighed, perhaps, the wisdom I seek does not wear robes or read scrolls. Perhaps it laughs in the market, he thought to himself. And with that thought, the winds of destiny began to stir. That same night, King Odum dreamed a strange dream. He saw a tortoise sitting on his throne, drumming with golden sticks, while all his wise men bowed before it. The tortoise spoke in a man's voice, wisdom crawls slowly, but it always reaches its destination. The king awoke in a sweat. He called his chief priest and said, "Tell me, what does this dream mean?" The priest bowed low. "My king, perhaps it means that solution will come from where you least expect it." The king frowned but nodded. "Send for every storyteller, drummer, and fool in the land. I must find this wisdom before dawn." By sunrise, a royal messenger arrived in the market square. By order of King Odum. Let all entertainers come to the palace at once. The king seeks the one who can answer his question. The market went silent, then laughter erupted. One of the women in the crowd asked mockingly, "Even our village fool can go, eh?" But the messenger replied, "Let him try. Maybe the king needs laughter to solve his problems." Mbe bowed dramatically, he picked up his drum and followed the messenger. When Mbe entered the royal courtyard, the atmosphere was entirely different from the casual mockery of the market. Courtyard drums beat a formal rhythm, and footsteps echoed on stone. He saw the wise men seated in a circle, each wearing elaborate robes with scrolls tucked into their belts and feathers in their hair marking their scholarly status. The king sat upon his stool of ivory, his eyes heavy with doubt and weariness. The king studied the young man before him. "You are Mbe, the fool of Umuodo." Mbe bowed respectfully. "Yes, my king. Fool to many, servant to truth." A ripple of laughter ran through the wise men, who exchanged knowing looks and smirks. The king leaned forward. "Then answer me this, what is the greatest wisdom in the world?" The wise men whispered among themselves, each expecting nonsense from the village fool's mouth. This should be entertaining, at least, they thought. Mbe tapped his drum softly, the sound gentle in the formal space. Then he looked up and said clearly, "The greatest wisdom, my king, is knowing when to listen." The courtyard fell silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The king leaned forward further, his interest caught. "Explain yourself." "A tree listens before it grows," Mbe said, his voice calm and certain. "The river listens before it flows. Even the drum listens to silence before it speaks. So a king who listens rules better than one who speaks too quickly." The king's face broke into a slow smile. The wise men shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly aware that this fool had just taught them something they had somehow missed in all their years of study. "You speak well, fool," the king said. "Perhaps your madness hides reason." The king was so pleased with Mbe's answer that he made an immediate decision. Drums of celebration began to beat, and palace officials scrambled to prepare for an unexpected guest. "You shall dine at my table," the king declared, "and speak freely, fool or not. Perhaps your laughter will cure the pride of my wise men." The court erupted with mixed murmurs, some in genuine laughter and approval, others in barely concealed envy. The wise men whispered urgently among themselves where they sat. "We study for years, and now a street clown takes the king's ear. This fool will ruin us all. Our positions, our influence, all threatened by a nobody." But Mbe only smiled his characteristic bright smile and bowed deeply. "The wind does not argue with leaves," he said softly. "It simply blows." Days passed, and the king's favor towards Mbe grew stronger. The young man's simple wisdom and genuine laughter brought a lightness to the palace that had been missing for years. But jealousy is a quiet poison, and it was spreading among the learned men. One night, with a low drumbeat marking the late hour and crickets singing in the darkness, the wise men met secretly under the old Irako tree at the edge of the palace grounds. The chief sage spoke first, his voice low and urgent, "We must make the fool fall. Let us test him before the king. If he fails, the king's laughter will turn to anger, and we will have our positions back." They nodded in agreement, their faces harsh in the moonlight, and began to plan a riddle so difficult that no man could solve it. At sunrise, the king's court filled with excitement. Palace drums announced a special gathering, and nobles crowded in to listen to the fool. The chief sage stepped forward, a sly smile on his face. "Your Majesty, we have a riddle even the spirits cannot answer. Let your fool prove his wisdom." The king, curious and confident in his new advisor, agreed. "Let the fool be tested." The chief sage turned to Mbe, his smile growing wider. "Mbe, tell us, what grows without roots, moves without feet, and dies without being killed?" The crowd murmured with appreciation for the difficulty of the question. The king leaned forward in anticipation. Mbe smiled gently and tapped his drum softly, its rhythm like a heartbeat. "That is easy, my lords. It is a dream. A dream grows in sleep, walks in the mind, and dies with the morning." The crowd gasped. The wise men's faces turned pale with shock and disappointment. The king threw back his head and laughed, the sound genuine and delighted. "Ha! Even dreams bow to the fool's tongue." From that day forward, the people began to call him Mbe the Wise Fool, and his reputation spread beyond the palace walls. But envy has many faces and knows many paths. The wise men, desperate now, went to the queen mother, the king's own mother, a woman of great influence. They twisted their tales carefully, making them sound like concern rather than jealousy. "My lady," they said with false humility, "this fool mocks the king before the people. He makes light of serious matters. Soon, he will mock the throne itself, and the kingdom's dignity will be destroyed." The queen mother frowned, her aged face creasing with worry. "Then let us see how wise he truly is." That night, she went to her son the king and spoke with the authority only a mother can wield. "Send this fool to visit the queen of puzzles in the kingdom of Nkata. If he returns with her answer, he is truly wise. If not, let him never show his face again." The king agreed reluctantly, not wanting to lose his advisor but unable to refuse his mother's request. "So be it," he said. When Mbe heard the news, he bowed deeply, showing no fear. "If wisdom lives in Nkata, then the road is my teacher." And so, he packed his talking drum, tied a gourd of water to his belt, wrapped some dried fish in leaves, and began his journey into the unknown. For 7 days and nights, Mbe walked through forests thick with ancient trees and hills that seemed to touch the sky. Soft travel drums seemed to follow him from village to village, as if the land itself was announcing his passage. He slept under trees when darkness fell, and shared food with strangers who marveled at his drum playing. He played his drum to earn rest in distant villages, his music opening doors that suspicion would have kept closed. But one night, as he camped by the banks of a quiet river, he heard a woman's voice carried on the wind. "Many go to seek the queen of puzzles, but few return. Wisdom is not always kind." He opened his eyes quickly and sat up, searching the darkness. But he saw no one. He whispered to the night, to the moon, to whatever spirits might be listening, "Then let wisdom test me. I will not turn back." And in the distance, as if in answer, the drum of destiny beat even louder in the night. After many days of travel, his feet sore and his wrapper dusty with the road, Mbe arrived at the gates of Nkata, the land of riddles and rain. Foreign drums beat rhythms he had never heard before, and the market chatter came in a dialect that twisted familiar words into new meanings. It was said that the people there spoke in proverbs and tested every stranger before letting them enter. The guards at the gate, tall men with elaborate spears and suspicious eyes, stopped him immediately. "State your name and purpose," the first guard demanded. Mbe bowed respectfully, noting how different everything was here. "I am Mbe of Umuodo, servant of truth, messenger of King Odum. I come seeking the queen of puzzles." The guards looked at each other and laughed, but it was not unkind laughter. "Many men come seeking her," the second guard said. "Few return. But if you can answer one question, you may pass. The first guard stepped closer. What breaks without being touched? A promise, the fool answered. The guards looked at each other again, this time with impressed expressions. The first guard stepped aside and gestured toward the city. Go on, Bay of Umuodo. The queen awaits. The palace of Nkata was unlike anything Bay had seen. Water trickled through carved channels in the floor, creating a constant musical undertone. A soft flute played somewhere unseen. Everything was calm, elegant, deliberately designed to make visitors feel simultaneously welcome and judged. The Queen of Puzzles sat upon a throne carved like a labyrinth, its wooden paths twisting in patterns that hurt the eye to follow. Her beauty was sharp as moonlight on water, not soft or comforting, but clear and undeniable. She was perhaps 30 years old, with eyes that seemed to read souls like scrolls. Those eyes studied Mbae as though she could see not just his present but his past and future as well. So, she said, her voice like silk over stone, you are the fool who speaks like a sage. Tell me, Mbae, do you think yourself wise? Mbae met her gaze without flinching but with proper respect. No, my queen. Only water calls itself clear. I am but a river learning to flow. The queen's lips curved into the faintest smile. Good. Then let us see if your current runs deep. The queen raised her hand in a gesture that commanded absolute attention. The soft sounds of the court fell into complete silence. Here is your first puzzle.
Tell me, fool, what moves without feet and roars without a mouth?
The thunder that follows truth, your majesty.
The queen's lips curved into a fuller smile, and something flickered in her eyes, surprise, perhaps, respect. The court murmured among themselves. Few travelers had ever passed the first test. Most stumbled on the threshold and were sent away, embarrassed but alive. Days passed. Mbae was given a room in the palace, simple but comfortable, and allowed to wander the gardens. He played his drum for the children of the servants, told stories to anyone who cared to listen. Finally, the queen summoned him again. This time, there was a crackling fire in the chamber despite the day's warmth, and low suspenseful drumming came from somewhere in the shadows. Second puzzle, Fool of Umuodo, the queen said, while watching him carefully. What can fill a room but takes no space? Mbae gazed around the hall, his eyes moving across the gathered courtiers, the elaborate wall carvings, the ceremonial objects. He thought of the laughter of children playing in his village. He thought of the music of drums filling the market square. Then he said,
Light, my queen.
And what of darkness?
Darkness too, for both are guests of silence.
The queen's eyes softened, almost very impressed. The court fell into a deeper silence, the kind that comes when something unexpected has happened. She dismissed him with a nod, but in her heart, curiosity bloomed like a night-flowering plant. Who is this young man who answered riddles as if they were simple conversation? One evening, when the sun had set and evening drums marked the transition to night, the queen called Mbae privately to her garden. No courtiers. No advisors. Just the two of them under the darkening sky. The moonlight fell on a silver pond, making it glow like captured starlight. The scent of night-blooming flowers filled the air, sweet and slightly intoxicating. The queen stood by the water, and when she spoke, her voice was softer than he had ever heard it. You have answered with your mind, but can you answer with your heart?
This is my final riddle. What lives when fed with love, and dies when ignored?
The soul of a kingdom, or the heart of a woman.
For a long time, the queen said nothing. She simply sat there and wondered, the moonlight painting her in silver and shadow. Then she smiled, not as a ruler testing a subject, but as a woman speaking to a man who understood something essential. You speak as one who has known pain. To be called a fool by all, Mbae said softly, yet still smiling, that is its own kind of pain. And for the first time since he had entered her kingdom, the queen laughed, not at him, but with him. The sound was like bells, unexpected and beautiful.
The queen smiles at the fool.
He is no fool. Only men afraid of truth call him that.
In the days that followed, the queen found herself thinking of Mbeya's words at odd moments. She would be reviewing petitions and remember his smile. She would be judging disputes and recall his voice. Morning birds sang their songs while whispering maids noticed their queen's distraction. Her court advisors grew increasingly uneasy as they watched this unprecedented situation unfold. "My queen," they warned you in private council, "this fool will cloud your judgment. No man can answer all your riddles unless he uses trickery. He must be a sorcerer or a spy." The queen only said, her voice cool but firm, "A wise man plays to win. A wise fool plays to learn. Which would you rather trust?" Still, to silence her doubters and perhaps to test her own feelings, she prepared one final challenge, one that could cost Mbe his life. If he truly was wise, he would survive. If he was merely clever or lucky, he would not, so she thought. On the 7th day since Mbe had entered Nkata, the queen gathered her full court in the main hall. Loud drumbeats announced the gravity of the occasion. The palace crowd murmured with anticipation and nervous energy. The queen stood before her throne and declared in a voice that carried to every corner, "Fool of Umuodo, this is your final puzzle. Before you stand 2 jars." She gestured, and servants brought forth 2 identical clay vessels, sealed with wax. One holds truth, the other death. Choose correctly, and you may return home in honor. Choose wrong, and you shall drink your last. A collective gasp ran through the gathered crowd. This was unprecedented, the queen had never before made the stakes so high. Mbe bowed deeply. He walked around the jars slowly, his footsteps deliberate. He tapped his drum softly, once, twice, 3 times. The sound echoed strangely in the tense silence. Then he stopped and said, "If both jars carry your spirit, then neither can hold death, for a wise queen's essence is bound only to life." He lifted one jar, the one on the right, and drank deeply from it. The hall gasped. Some women covered their mouths in horror. The queen stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then slowly, she smiled. "You chose correctly." At her signal, a servant shattered the other jar. From it poured thick black smoke that hissed and writhed before dissipating. The court fell to their knees, some in relief, others in awe. The queen spoke quietly, but everyone heard her. "You have not only passed my test, Mbe, you have earned my respect." The queen sent Mbe home with gold enough to make him wealthy, a royal seal that would grant him safe passage anywhere in the known lands, and her blessing spoken over him in the old tongue. Triumphant drums played as he prepared to leave, and birds soared overhead as if celebrating. But as he stood at the gates of Nkata, preparing to depart, she came to him one last time. Away from the court, away from the ceremony, just the 2 of them in the early morning light. She whispered, "Safe travels, fool of Umuodo." Mbe bowed deeply, his characteristic smile warm and genuine. "My queen." And so he returned to Umuodo, no longer seen as a fool by those who truly looked, but carrying the weight of something new, love, respect, admiration, and the beginning of a destiny he had never imagined.
The fool returns bearing the mark of wisdom.
When Mbe returned to King Odum's palace, the news of his approach had preceded him. The people gathered at the palace gates to see if the rumors were true. Had the village fool truly survived the Queen of Puzzles? Royal trumpets announced his arrival, and village cheers erupted as he came into view, walking with quiet dignity, his drum under his arm and a bag of gold over his shoulder. The king's eyes widened as Mbe bowed before him. "By the spirits! The fool has returned from the Queen of Puzzles alive. And laden with gifts." Mbe smiled and said, "Your Majesty, she sends you peace, and proof that a fool can walk through riddles and not stumble." The king, overcome with joy and relief, embraced him like a son. "Mbe, today you are no longer a fool in anyone's eyes, but a true reflection of wisdom." The jealous wise men who had sent Mbe on this supposedly impossible journey now trembled before the king. Drums of justice beat as their scheming was revealed before the full court. Someone had talked, perhaps a guilty conscience, perhaps a servant who had overheard their plotting. King Odum's voice was stern, his disappointment clear. "You plotted against one who served wisdom with humility. You sought his death out of your own pride. Therefore, you will study under him until you learn the meaning of truth." And so, the wise men, these scholars who had mocked a simple drummer, bowed before the man they once called fool. It was a reversal none of them had imagined possible. Mbe only smiled his characteristic bright smile and said gently, "The proud drink from empty cups. But any cup can be refilled if one is willing to empty it first." Among the crowd watching Mbe's triumphant return was Princess Nika, the king's only child. She was 20 years old, known throughout the land for being kind, and as radiant as dawn breaking over the hills. Soft harp music played in the palace gardens where she often walked, and it was there that she had first seen Mbe upon his return. She had watched him from afar during his time in the palace before his journey, fascinated by his calm spirit and the way he seemed to see through to the heart of things. Now that he had returned covered in glory, she found her fascination deepening into something else. Later that evening, she approached him in the garden where he sat playing his drum softly, practicing rhythms he had learned in kata. "My father trusts you more than any man in his court," she said, startling him slightly. "Tell me, Mbe, do you ever tire of laughter?" Mbe looked up at her, and for a moment, he simply took in her presence, the intelligence in her eyes, the gentleness in her bearing. "Laughter is the shield of the broken," he said honestly. "Without it, I would drown in the world's noise." They talked until the stars rose, filling the sky with their ancient light. And somewhere between their words about wisdom and foolishness, about duty and desire, their hearts began to listen to a rhythm that had nothing to do with drums.
You taught my father to listen. What will you teach me?
That love too is a riddle.
Weeks passed. The palace noticed what was growing between Mbe and Princess Nika, and tongues wagged in corners and corridors. Finally, one morning marked by royal drums, the king called Mbe to a private audience. "My daughter has chosen no suitor," the king said, studying the young man before him, though many princes from neighboring kingdoms beg for her hand. Their fathers offer land, cattle, gold, alliances, but she hasn't taken likeness to none. She speaks your name with warmth. "Tell me, fool, do you love my child?" Mbe bowed low, his heart pounding but his voice steady. "I love her as the earth loves the rain, not for beauty, but for life itself." The king nodded slowly, something like satisfaction crossing his face. "Then prove your worth not by words, but by service. Rule beside me as my advisor for a season. Let me see if your wisdom extends beyond riddles into the realm of governance." And so, Mbe began his final trial, not of riddles or puzzles, but of leadership, of making decisions that affected thousands of lives, of learning what it truly meant to serve a kingdom. A year of drought came upon Umuodo like a curse. The rains failed to arrive when expected, then failed again. Crops withered in the fields, their leaves turning brown and brittle. The river that had always flowed began to show its rocky bottom. Palace commotion increased as desperate farmers came seeking help, and soldiers had to maintain order as food grew scarce. Famine murmurs spread through the villages like disease. The king's other advisors suggested hoarding the palace stores, protecting the nobility first. But Mbe gathered the elders, both the village elders and the palace council, and spoke with quiet conviction. "If the sky withholds its tears, perhaps the earth has been wronged. Perhaps we have forgotten that a kingdom is not its palace, but its people." He convinced the king to order the palace food stores open to the poor, distributed fairly among all who needed it. Then he led the people in prayer by the river, not as a ruler speaking to subjects, but as one humble person among many, asking for mercy from powers greater than crowns. That night, for the first time in months, rain poured down. It fell softly at first, then steadily, soaking into the grateful earth. The people wept with joy, and some said it was the tears of the gods answering the tears of their servant. The king, watching the rain fall from his palace window, declared with wonder in his voice, "Truly, he is remarkable." When the rains returned in full and the crops began to grow again, the king kept his promise. Drums beat, flutes played, and women's voices rose in ululation that could be heard across the entire kingdom. Laughter, genuine and joyful, filled the land. The king gave his daughter's hand to Mbe in a ceremony that brought together nobles and commoners alike. As he placed Neka's hand in Mbe's, he said before all the assembled witnesses, "The fool who listened has become the wisest of men. Let all the land bear witness, the heart of wisdom now beats beside the crown." Even the queen of puzzles herself sent gifts, gold and intricate riddles carved in ivory, beautiful objects that spoke of respect and perhaps something more. Some whispered that she had hoped Mbe might return to Nkata, but if not, she bore no ill will. Her gifts were generous and her message gracious. May wisdom and love walk together in your house. On that day, laughter filled the land once more. The boy who had been mocked in the market square now stood beside a princess, and no one who witnessed it could say the world was not a place of wonders. Years passed like water flowing in the river, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, but always moving forward. Mbe and Princess Neka had children who played in the palace gardens, their laughter echoing where once only formal speech had been heard. The kingdom prospered under King Odum's continued rule, with Mbe as his chief advisor. But time touches even kings. King Odum grew old, his hair turning white as egret feathers, his steps becoming slow and measured. One evening, as the sun set over his kingdom painting the sky in colors of farewell, he called Mbe to his private chambers. Gentle drums played somewhere in the distance, marking the end of another day. The old king sat in his favorite chair, looking out over the land he had ruled for so long. "My son," he said, for that is what he had come to call Mbe, "I have lived long enough to see many foolish wise men and one wise fool. You have taught me that knowledge sits in books, but wisdom walks in the heart." He lifted his ceremonial staff, the symbol of royal authority, carved from the wood of the first Irako tree that had ever grown in Umuodo, and placed it in Mbe's hands. His grip was weak but deliberate. "Rule with laughter, my son," the king said, his voice fading like the daylight. "Let wisdom dance, not boast. Remember that the smallest voices sometimes carry the greatest truth, and that a king who forgets he was once a child becomes a tyrant." Before the next dawn came, King Odum breathed his last, peaceful in the knowledge that his kingdom would be in good hands. And so Mbe, once the fool of Umuodo, once the boy who talked to birds and was mocked in the market square, once the drummer who played for scraps and made children laugh, became King Mbe Odum II, the ruler who taught that wisdom and laughter are twins of the same mother. In the years that followed, King Mbe's rule became legendary. He never forgot where he came from. He kept his old patchwork robe hanging in his chambers, and sometimes, when matters of state grew too heavy, he would take out his drum and play in the market square, just as he had done as a young man. He judged disputes with both wisdom and compassion. When nobles argued over land, he would ask them to work the disputed field together for a season. Whoever harvested the most would win not the land, but the right to share it with the other. When traders complained of unfair prices, he would disguise himself and visit the markets to see the truth with his own eyes. His children grew up learning both the formal education of royalty and the practical wisdom of the common people. He insisted they spend time in every part of the kingdom, from the palace to the poorest villages, so they would understand that the crown serves the people, not the other way around. The Queen of Puzzles visited once, years later, to see the man who had stolen her heart and then given it back transformed. She found him happy, surrounded by family, serving his people with the same bright smile he had worn as a young fool. They spoke late into the night about riddles and love and the paths not taken, and when she left, she carried with her the peace of knowing he had found his right place in the world. Princess Neka, now Queen Neka, ruled beside him as his equal, her intelligence complementing his wisdom, her strength balancing his gentleness. Together they created a court where questions were valued more than answers, where laughter was seen as a form of prayer, and where the title of fool became one of honor rather than mockery. The wise men who had once plotted against Mbe became his most loyal advisors, having learned through years of study under him that true wisdom requires humility. And on quiet evenings, when the sun set over the kingdom and painted the sky in colors of fire and hope, Mbe would sit in the garden where he had first truly spoken with Nika. He would play his drum softly, and the rhythm would move across the land like a heartbeat. The people still told his story under moonlight, passing it from grandmother to grandchild, from one generation to the next. They would gather around fires and begin and tell the tale of the fool who became king. The drum would beat softly in the distance, and the children would fall asleep dreaming of talking to birds, of answering impossible riddles, of finding wisdom in unexpected places. And somewhere in the palace, King Mbe would smile in his sleep, that same bright smile that had carried him from mockery to throne, from foolishness to wisdom, from loneliness to love. The tortoise had crawled slowly, but he had indeed reached the crown.
And so, the fool became the crown of wisdom, a reminder that truth often laughs first.
To be wise, one must never stop listening.